A very good morning to all of you. So, I welcome you all to session number 46 of the ICF webinar series that we started last year on the 10th of May. And our topic for today is editing translations from a multicultural perspective. And our speaker for today is Sara Kitaoji. She is a Japanese English translator and an academic editor, and she will provide helpful strategies for translators and editors working with different kinds of translated texts. Over to you, Sara.
So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands on which we work, meet, and live. I acknowledge that I'm presenting this webinar from the land of the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation. I recognize their continuing connections to land, water, and community, and I pay respect to their elders past and present. Sovereignty has never been ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. For overseas attendees who aren't familiar with this, the acknowledgement of country is given at the start of the gatherings in Australia as a vital part of the ongoing reconciliation process and the struggle to address the injustices of this nation's past. It prompts us to think about how we can each contribute to building a more united Australia that recognises and celebrates our first Australians who have been marginalised and excluded from this society since colonisation. For my part, this year I aim to learn more about the diverse languages of the oldest surviving civilization in the world, something I should have started with my first linguistics class back in 1995. 学一门语言就是多一个观察世界的窗户。To learn a language is to have one more window from which to look at the world. Please don't be intimidated by my Mandarin. My pronunciation is actually very horrible. If there are any Mandarin speakers here, they'll be laughing at my terrible attempt at tones. Pronunciation in Mandarin is not my forte. I'm much more comfortable reading and writing. You've probably seen this Chinese proverb before. It's popular on language learning sites, though many of my Chinese friends say they don't know it. The proverb might sound like a cliche, but I find it rings true from my own experience with language. And looking at the world from these windows, I feel like I've always been hopping between different worlds. I see translation as a way of navigating between different windows and worlds. If translators are navigators between worlds of language and culture, then editors assume the important role of helping to smooth that navigation process. Whether you are a translator or an editor, I hope my talk today will offer some signposts to help you navigate these journeys between worlds. I have some quick questions for you. So with Vivek's help, as I'm not able to see everyone while I'm screen sharing, Vivek, could you please tell me how many thumbs up responses there are?
Sure.
So my first question, how many of you have translated a text before from any language into any other language? Vivek, do you have numbers?
Only two.
Oh, okay. And how many of you had to edit your own translations that you translated? And how many of you have edited other people's translations? No? There has to be more than this. I don't believe it. Well, I'm looking forward to your feedback and learning and hearing about your experiences during the Q&A. So, language is a much more complex, dynamic phenomenon than the categories and words we often use to talk about it. I'm thinking about how languages and the act of translation have always been an intrinsic part of my own life, not something I just studied at school. I was born in Melbourne to Japanese parents who came to Australia in the 1960s for anthropological and sociological research with Aboriginal, Australian and Torres Strait Islander communities. But when I started talking, my parents were lecturing in Paris for a year. So my first language was French. And then I moved back to Australia where the native language or mother tongue of my parents and grandparents was Japanese. I read Japanese books, especially manga, and watched a lot of anime and Japanese movies. And then at school, I quickly had to learn English to avoid being bullied or othered. I chose not to speak much until I was 13, something that my partner and my many friends don't believe right now because I seem to be making up for lost time. I do talk a lot. But nevertheless, my primary language for written communication became English. So Australian schools teach a second or a foreign language. So my second language in primary school was German. My high school, though, taught only Japanese and German. So in high school, I had to study French. That first language of mine I'd long forgotten. I was forced to study it in the library by myself through distance learning with a cassette recorder. And at university, I studied Japanese and ancient Greek, but it was only afterwards that I finally studied languages for fun rather than out of necessity. So that was Italian, Mandarin, Russian, Cantonese, and a bit of Spanish. I'd always been navigating different worlds on my own, but studying linguistics at Melbourne University finally gave me a theoretical framework for this navigation. I started teaching Japanese and English when I was 16, and I continued to teach in Australia and Japan, part-time and full-time, until my 30s. Teaching any language helps you as an editor or translator, especially explaining grammar and writing conventions to your clients. Attending a seminar on Aboriginal Australian languages last year, however, I realised that my relationship with language has always been quite separate from this land. Most Australians don't speak a First Nations language. English is a de facto national language here with a history of less than 250 years. We've applied foreign English names to all kinds of things. So this bird, who visits my balcony, for instance, was given the rather ugly name crowshrike or bell magpie at first. We now call them currawongs, which is an onomatopoeic or sound symbolic name derived from the Aboriginal Australian language. Interestingly, these currawongs have regional dialects of their own. My linguistic experience might be common in multilingual regions. So you could say, oh, that's just Sara, she's just weird. But it's also becoming increasingly common in places that were predominantly monolingual. So today I'll try to avoid using words that never really made sense to me, like foreign, native, or first language, or mother tongue. Instead, I'll use some terms from the field of translation studies. Source language, the language that is to be translated. Target language, which is the language of the translation. Source text, which is the original text. And target text, the finished product, or the translated text. You can see here how the process behind an edited translation or target text differs from that of the standard edited text. So it's helpful to speak the translator's language, which leads to my next point. In life, relationships are key. As any editor knows, it's important to know the author behind the text we're editing. What's their background, experience, motivations? This helps to inform our editing work and build strong working relationships. The more editors and translators know about each other's experience, skills, and weaknesses, the better. This can be hard for editors to assess, though, if they're not familiar with the source language or source language culture. More on that later. So, second, respecting cultural differences. Sounds obvious, but it's not easy, even for me, juggling all these different worlds. The Japanese language, for example, is coded to constantly remind us of our relationship with people we are communicating with or about. Australian society, on the other hand, prefers to pretend that hierarchy doesn't exist, even when it does. Of course it does. Every society has hierarchy. But in Australia, we strive to treat tradespeople, restaurant staff, and even our professors as equals. In Japan, we're respectful, but we don't treat strangers as friends, and we never forget that someone is being paid to provide a service. Since I work with many Asian and European authors, I talk about my clients, not my authors. I'd only call someone my author if I was hiring them to write something for me. I'm not saying that's what everyone should do, but that's what works best for me and the clients for whom I provide editing and translation services. So each relationship involving diverse cultural backgrounds requires negotiation and accommodation. This has to go beyond just proclaiming, I'm friendly and inclusive and I treat everyone as equals. Think about whether you might be imposing your values and norms of communication on others. Are others striving to accommodate you? Or are you making that extra effort to understand and accommodate their needs, expectations, and sensibilities? Here's an example that epitomizes what often happens in cross-cultural interactions. When people visit my apartment in Sydney for the first time, I think after this no one's going to want to visit me, but anyway, when people visit me for the first time, I notice that some hesitate in the doorway. They look at the shoes in the entrance. They look at my bare feet, and then they take off their shoes. Other people, however, just walk right in. Interestingly, Australian tradespeople, at least those who come here, do hesitate. This is Australia, and I don't mind if people walk in with their shoes on. I really don't. I've learned to accommodate that, and it's not that I like these people any less, but I always notice and appreciate that hesitation in the doorway when it happens. It says to me that that person is observant and trying to suss out and accommodate my sensibilities, and I appreciate that. So many things like this happen in cross-cultural physical, verbal, and written interactions. The dynamics differ depending on whether you're in the country of the source language or target language. For Japanese guests, for example, I provide slippers in Australia, as I know how much they like them. I prefer being barefoot, but if I'm in Japan at my friends' houses, I make an effort to put slippers on because otherwise my friends feel uncomfortable. I don't go so far as providing separate slippers for the bathroom in Australia, but I would if my apartment were in Japan. A client will notice these hesitations and your efforts to accommodate, and your appreciation of their efforts to accommodate. They'll be more likely to trust you to work well, unchaperoned, with their colleagues, family, or friends. So your network will just grow from there. Also, understand your role in any project. Editor, proofreader, translation checker. In Japan, there's a category called native checker or native check. It basically involves handing an English language text to a native speaker, quote, and to check it, regardless of their qualifications or background. I prefer to avoid this term myself, but be aware that it's a thing, it exists, and I'm sure there are similar terms in other languages. And does your client understand the differences between these roles? There's still a lack of understanding about the editing profession, especially in countries where English is not the dominant language. And as an editor, how much do you know of the challenges and deliberations that go into each translated text? The more you know, the more sensitively you'll be able to communicate with a translator, and the more informed your edit will be. Finally, establishing understanding of a common goal at the outset of a project, usually to produce the best possible TT or target text, is essential. Continue to refocus on that goal, though, throughout the project. Don't lose sight of the goal. So, some helpful questions for editors to bear in mind. Not necessarily to ask translators directly. Please don't do that. First, as an editor not familiar with the source language, consider the translator's competence in the target and source languages. Translators are generally stronger in the target language than in the source language. Many translation agencies, I'm just trying to move my... many translation agencies require native speakers in the target language. Quote, native speakers. I translate in both directions, but only certain genres. It's not common or recommended, as most translators are faster and better translating in one direction than in the other. Second, consider their experience in the genre or field. I prefer talking about experience rather than professional or amateur. A great professional translator of literature might have no experience at all in translating a science textbook or a company logo and story to sell a product. Compared to Italian, Spanish, French, or German bilinguals, some languages have such a tiny translator pool that many translators end up straddling a huge range of fields, academic, IT, business. I certainly did. But it's difficult for one person to have a firm grasp of multiple genres and fields in two languages, let alone one. Experienced translators, though, are very good researchers and very flexible. Third, observe whether the translator is immersed in the source language or target language environment. This can make a huge difference to their linguistic and cultural awareness and understanding. It also affects how you communicate with them. As an Australian in Japan, I kept in touch with my friends overseas. I used social media, I read English language newspapers, and I watched movies. But there are some things I just lost touch with. And my English-speaking friends in Tokyo could all speak some Japanese, which meant we often spoke in a kind of hybrid English. Our conversations assumed more knowledge of Japanese words and culture than my conversations with friends in Australia now. And fourth, consider the translator's understanding of the editing process and profession. Translators are similar to authors. They might not have been professionally edited before, or they might only have experience with the native checker type work in Japan. Or they might work as editors or proofreaders themselves. Have you ever tried editing a fellow editor's work before? Okay, I'm joking. But most of my professional editing colleagues appreciate being edited, as I do. But I think we do still adapt our approach accordingly. Some questions for translators to bear in mind. So be mindful of whether a source text has been edited before you start translating it, as many projects don't have the budget or experience to hire a source text editor. I check the source text carefully first and ask the client to clarify or edit certain parts. Even then, I'm often told by my client that they further clarified the structural phrasing of the source text based on my target text. Of course, it depends on the project. You can't do this with source texts that have already been published, like novels. I've worked on many projects where I'm responsible for the entire process, from editing the source text to translating, editing, and proofreading the final product. Many clients don't have the budget to hire an editor and proofreader in addition to a translator. So my translation is the final product. My PhD research focused on literary translation, though professionally I translated texts in a wide range of fields for academia, business, government, TV, and non-profit organizations. Many translation manuals don't focus on editing, so I really didn't appreciate the profession, I confess, until I started working as an in-house editor for an educational publisher in Tokyo. And then I returned to Australia and sat IPED's accreditation exam, which is my most useful editing qualification by far. In my view, a degree in editing isn't essential, but ongoing professional development is. So these days, I put on different hats to approach the text from different angles at each stage of the process. Ideally, I leave a day between stages to switch mindsets and focus. Of course, this is ideally. Often with deadlines, it's not possible. But I do try to consciously switch my mindset and focus between stages. Many of you probably already do this if you're a writer and an editor, or an editor and a proofreader. So I start with editing the source text if necessary, then I translate, mainly for meaning and structure instinctively at first, and then I check dictionaries and other sources. Then I move on to editing, focusing on what works and flows best in English. This might involve taking liberties with the translation, depending on the purpose of the text. We'll talk about that later. And then I proofread, focusing on details like punctuation, spelling, and aligning the text with style guides. That doesn't mean to say that I don't notice translation errors when I'm editing or proofreading, but these hats are definitely useful for me. Every translator has their own process, and I'm not trying to impose my method on anyone. But I think you'll agree that every author and translator can benefit from an editor, and every editor from a proofreader. So if you're performing all these tasks yourself as the translator, editor, and proofreader of a target text, consider editing as a vital step in the process with a separate skill set that you might not have learned if you've only studied translation before. If you're lucky enough to have an editor, consider their familiarity with the source language and source language culture. Consider how much information to pass on to smooth the transition. The style sheet for an editor who can't read the source language is different to a translation style sheet. So be mindful of who you're working with and their background, expertise, and expectations. This helps editors understand potential issues with the target text, whether you know the source language or not. It also helps editors and translators build strong, long-lasting professional relationships. And for these relationships, I noted it's important to establish and maintain a common goal, which is usually to produce the best possible target text. But what makes a good translation. We often hear people discussing how faithful a translation is to the original. Is a faithful translation a good translation? In editing, we talk about respecting and preserving the author's voice. But whose voice are we editing in a target text? The source text authors or the translators? How much leeway do we have to adjust that voice? I can't give you a simple answer to questions that have been debated forever in linguistics and probably will be forever, as well as literary and translation theories. But try to be aware of these issues in your work. If we interpret faithful as literal, then Vladimir Nabokov would have agreed. Nabokov was very vocal about this when he said, the only object and justification of translation is the conveying of the most exact information possible, and this can only be achieved by a literal translation with notes. So, of course, he was talking mainly about literary translation, being a writer himself. He translated from French and English into Russian. He's known for his translation of Alice in Wonderland into Russian in the 1920s. He also translated Russian into English, notably Pushkin. He would probably have been a very difficult translator to edit. I'm glad it wasn't me. Another scholar, Benjamin Jowett, in the UK, however, was a lot more practical when he said, all translation is compromise, the effort to be literal and the effort to be idiomatic. Jowett was known for translating Plato in a simple, straightforward style back in 1871. He was one of the first to do so. So rather than talk about good translations, I think for professional purposes, rather than in the academic arena, it's more useful to talk about effective translations. And an effective translation is one that achieves its purpose. And that purpose, as you can see, varies greatly depending on the nature of the text. This is just a very rough guide. There are so many more genres and so many more purposes. This will give you something of an idea. So early translation theory began, of course, with Bible translations. Consider the needs of a religious text, as opposed to, say, for instance, the needs of a translation of COVID-19 vaccine research results. So religious texts aim to probably convert people in countries and cultures that are very, very different from maybe the origin of the religion. So a faithful translation is often not possible, as in a word for word or literal translation. The objective is something completely different. On the other hand, scientific texts are sometimes or often an exception to the rule, in that the translator could be stronger in the source language rather than the target language, as accuracy of understanding of the science is more important than the aesthetics in a literary text, for example. Also consider whether translation is used for internal purposes. This is probably not so relevant to editors, but I've often been asked to translate pages and pages of Japanese documents for Australian companies. We just want to know, to get the general gist of what these documents are about, and then if they find any of it interesting, they will ask me to do a proper translation. I also did similar work for Japanese TV, where they asked me to transcribe hours and hours of tape of interviews in English into Japanese, so that the producer could figure out what parts he wanted to pick and choose for a half-an-hour segment. Also think about, even within genres, the differences. A literary translation with academic footnotes for something like the Penguin book series would be very different to a translation of a children's picture book. So I won't go into it too much here. Let's move on to a very practical example. So this is a hypothetical self-introduction by a new faculty member at a Japanese university in a bilingual newsletter. It's very hypothetical, okay? The audience is restricted to faculty and staff who can't read the original Japanese text. So they might be, international faculty at this Japanese university and staff members, not necessarily, with English as their primary language, but they can read English better than Japanese. I haven't bothered with the title here due to space considerations, so I've started with the author's name and affiliation. And I've created this example to exaggerate some of the issues that arise, and also to make it fit onto a single PowerPoint slide. I say exaggerate, But every single issue I've embedded in this text is something I've encountered not just once, but many times throughout my career. And I've deliberately made a simple text to demonstrate how a huge range of issues can arise, even in what seems like a short and straightforward translation and editing task. And this is specifically Japanese, but I'll also talk in general terms, which you can relate to issues that arise in the languages and cultures that you're familiar with. I hope you'll tell me about some of them in the Q&A. So please have a quick read of this text and point out any issues you notice in the chat. It's not a test. Don't mind if you get stuff wrong. There's not really any right or wrong in a lot of these things. But what would you query with the translator or author? And are there any parts of the source text that you think might need editing? So let me get my chat screen up. And I hope some of you will give me some ideas. No? Nothing? Come on, Ben Cat. I can see you smiling.
To comprehend what is there.
Is there anything dodgy? It is overly polite, someone said, for an Australian readership. Imagine that this is an internal newsletter, bilingual newsletter for a Japanese university with a very international faculty. So there'll be some Aussies there, there'll be some Americans, there'll be Europeans, other Asian countries, staff members as well as faculty. And it's meant to be, the objective is, I would say, there's nothing wrong with the text grammatically, I think, unless I put some typos in there. It might even pass one of those native checks in Japan, but it's stilted, unnatural, and worst of all, I think it's ineffective. It doesn't achieve its objective, which is basically to establish some credibility for this new faculty member and establish friendly relations with her new colleagues. And to be honest, I'd probably, in this case, if I received this as a job, I'd ask for the original source text and offer to retranslate it, make it, embellish it a little bit and, try and achieve the same effect that the Japanese, which is perfectly legitimate, would achieve in the Japanese. Nobody? No? Akiko. I know Akiko is here. And Paul.
Konnichiwa.
In New South Wales. Hello. Good. Yes, maybe the Japanese term should be explained. Yep. It's too vague in its use of verbs. It may be even a bit cliched. Yep. Okay. All right. Cool. Okay, so I'm just going to go through this. Who is Professor Takeda? The level of formality needs adjusting. The opening is weak. Okay. All right. Sorry, the opening, it could just be an excerpt from the self-intro because I didn't have time to bother with the, hi, I am so-and-so. But yes, it is. The whole thing is very weak. Okay, so I'm just going to go through it, not in any particular order, just from top to bottom. Okay, so first of all, let me see if I can get my highlighter pen working. Okay, so this is going to be very detailed. I'll be going over general terms later. So the name, did you notice the name here is Yuriko Tabata and the email address says Tahata. This is probably a proofreader's thing. Note that in Japanese, there can be multiple readings of Chinese character names. And even Japanese people often don't know. They have to ask you, how do you read your name? Tabata and Tahata sounds dodgy to me. It's got to be one or the other. She probably would not have a name, the family name Tabata, and then have her email address Tahata. It's kind of a trick question. If you know Japanese, then you would probably notice this. Another issue here is the order of elements. So if you know Japanese or Chinese, maybe some other languages, we go from big units down to smaller units. In English, we go in the opposite direction. So we would start with associate professor in the Department of History in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Cornwall, which is a hypothetical university. So the order of elements, which is a syntactic or structural issue, is wrong. So it's to do with the textual conventions. Did you notice the quotation marks here? So I think most proofreaders and editors would delete these quotation marks. There is a very bad habit in contemporary Japanese writing, probably from magazines and maybe the internet, of overusing quotation marks. So if you've seen any Japanese titles of journal articles or conference papers, you might notice an excessive use of quotation marks for things that probably don't need quotation marks in English. And really, this is something that I usually would query with the source text and ask them if they really want to use quotation marks here. And even if they don't, I would explain that in English we wouldn't use quotation marks. Did anyone notice this bit? However, it wasn't until I graduated and became an adult. I swear, I didn't make this up. This has happened to me. I have had text like this before. Became an adult. What on earth does that mean? She graduated from university and became an adult.
Metamorphosis or something.
So I don't know what the coming of age is in India. In Australia, it can be 16 or 18, usually officially for a lot of things like driving and drinking. In Japan, the official coming of age ceremony is when you're 20. The city will hold like this, big official ceremony, and everyone gets dressed up in kimonos or suits, and
In India, it's 55.
No,
Nobody's an 55,
really?
and for men, it's 65.
But even though the official coming of age might be 20, and I think that's also the official age for drinking, you're really not considered an adult until you start working in Japan. So I had trouble with this because when I went to Japan as a graduate student, I was already 25 and I'd spent years already teaching and working full-time as well as part-time. And I was just going back to study as a graduate student, but I was still treated like I was very immature and a child. And someone explained to me, well, Sara, you're not really an adult until you enter the workforce. So in Japanese, this would have been seijin. So it's not so bad. But in English, I would change this to entered the workforce. Did you notice the use of foreigners here? Again, this goes back to how long your translator, might have been in the source language culture. So staying up to date with terminology and inclusive language, for example, you can do that especially if you're on social media. But I've come across foreigners quite a bit. And, it's a literal translation of Japanese gaikokujin, or, in Chinese, in Mandarin, it would be waigoren, which I also don't really like either because it's very, alienating and othering. Probably won't be able to change it in the source text, but I would definitely try to change it here. And did anyone else notice this? Traveled to Asia before. I haven't traveled to Asia before. This person is Japanese, writing in Japan, and she says she hasn't traveled to Asia before. Again, this is a cultural issue. I think maybe friends from the UK might understand this. Well, you know how sometimes the UK and Europe tend to be sort of regarded as different entities, even though the UK should be part of Europe, although these days it's not anymore. And in the same way, you get Japanese travel guides that say, Asia Hatsuryoko, which is first trip to Asia. So I would query this in the source text because I think that the Japanese should also be changed to be more inclusive and to, accept the fact that Japan is part of Asia. But I would definitely also, change this to other Asian countries or something in English. I left my company to move to Beijing, where I studied Chinese. So in Japanese, when you say Chugokugo or Chinese, it usually refers to Mandarin. And if you're referring to other Chinese languages like Cantonese or Shanghainese, you would specify that. In English, however, I do think because we have so many Chinese language speakers from different areas. It just makes sense to specify it and say Mandarin. It probably is Mandarin since she moved to Beijing. The opportunity to teach at this international university is an honor. I mean, there's nothing actually wrong with the sentence, but it is, as many people pointed out, very formal. And the problem usually is, again, it's a syntactic issue, because in Japanese, as in many other languages, the subject does not need to be mentioned. And also there is an excessive use of passive voice, but when the subject is not mentioned in the active voice sentence, it's often translated into the passive voice. In this case, this is an active sentence, but it's written without a human actor. And I think in English, you know, when we're being informal and friendly, it would be more normal to say, I'm honored. I'm grateful to be in the same department as Professor Takeda, who encouraged me to write a biography of Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. So Professor Takeda, in Japanese, I think you all know the word sensei, which is translated as teacher, master, professor. In English, professor is a very specific profession. So when I get something like this, I always Google and check what the actual position of that professor is. And then also check whether I should probably use doctor. But the other issue is that many Japanese lecturers do not have PhDs. So professor is often the default term that we use as a sign of respect instead of doctor. Who encouraged me to write a biography of Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. So a biography. In Japanese, as in many other languages, we don't have to indicate singular or plural, so number. It's probably not a biography of the one person. And these two people are a bit dodgy. Do you notice the difference in... So Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, this is a transliteration issue where Mandarin has two different transliteration systems. Well, they have other ones too, but two main ones. The one before the Cultural Revolution is called the Wei-Giles system. So this Mao Zedong, spelled Tsetung, is Wei-Giles. Zhou Enlai is the pinyin, which is used after the Cultural Revolution. So you have to be consistent if you're going to choose a transliteration system. And on top of that, you probably should use the standard one now, which is pinyin. So this should be spelled Z-E-D-O-N-G instead of T-S-E-T-U-N-G. That is because at a conference held in Perth, Australia in 2019, he gave an impressive talk on the Cultural Revolution. Again, very formal. A conference held in Perth, Australia in 2019, again, you know, should be something more like when I attended a conference I was impressed by. And also he gave a talk. If it's a conference, he probably presented a paper. So again, you know, knowledge of the field and terminology. My hobby is sado and cooking shojin ryori. Somebody pointed out that these terms should be defined. Again, one is in italics and the other one is not. So again, choose. There is a modern trend now to try to avoid using italics for foreign terms to be more inclusive. So that's fine, but choose your style one way or the other. And the other thing is transliteration again in Japanese for long vowel sounds, long O sound. Do we use an O with a macron? Do we use an O with the circumflex, which is a very old-fashioned style? Or do we use OU? So again, some knowledge of the transliteration system of language is helpful if you are editing a translated text. Corona has made daily life difficult. So I don't know what you call the COVID-19 pandemic informally in India, but Corona is what is often used in Japan. And if you're living in Japan and everyone around you is saying Corona, you tend to just sort of say Corona too. So again, this is what we call a lexical issue. It's a false friend, tricks you, just like this mail up here. In Japanese, we call email meru, not email, and it often just gets translated into mail. I hope I'll be able to teach online. I'm aware that I have a great deal to learn. I hope to learn from all of you. It's excessively humble. I need to see the source text in order to embellish it a little bit, but I would try to make it a little bit more confident and friendly towards English-speaking colleagues. Like, I look forward to working with you, drop me a line, something like that. Anyway, I told you it was going to be very detailed. And I will move on. Let me go back to automatic. So, false friends and other wordy issues. So when we're talking on the lexical level, the level of the word, as I said, I use many Japanese examples, but you can apply these concepts to languages that you know and translate or edit. So as Peter Newmark said in his popular textbook of translation, all words are more or less context bound in their meanings. So word for word or literal translations usually don't work. Words can be conditioned by their linguistic, referential, cultural, and individual or personal context. The false friends is one issue in language learning as well as in editing and translation. The semantic field, like what is the meaning of a color in different languages. If you're interested in that, we can talk about that in Q&A. Gender and pronouns, as I said, you know, do we know whether Professor Takeda is really a he? Because it probably was not indicated in the source text. The number, is it singular or plural? The use of inclusive language, the use of idiomatic expressions and eponyms, wordplay, like homophones and homonyms, and onomatopoeia and sound symbolism. Originally, I was going to talk about all these things, and then my partner said, well, it's going to take you an hour to explain each one, so I just listed them in the bullet point list. There are many examples of false friends. So if you're interested later, you can check what these false friends are or try and figure out what they mean. I'll give you some funny examples, though, that you might recognize. Does anyone recognize this quotation? It happened recently, a couple of years ago. Feel free to unmute or write it in the chat. World leaders, we will make sure that we put them against the wall and they will have to do their job to protect our futures. Who said that?
I think that was Greta Thunberg.
Very good, Pamela. Yes. So she got in quite a bit of trouble for that because she was using a term that she knew in Swedish, I think, and her English is excellent, which again, you know, fooled a lot of people because they thought then that, you know, she actually meant this and she meant to execute all these world leaders against the wall. Here's another one. And Pam, you're not allowed to answer this one because you told me about this one. Thank you and your delicious wife for your warm welcome, the perfect organization of this trip. Who on earth said that? Paul? No, this wasn't Trump.
I think that was
Good guess, Paul.
Prime Minister Abbott.
It wasn't Abbott either. No, it was President Emmanuel Macron, who has absolutely excellent English. I'm sure he had the benefit of a wonderful education. His English is immaculate, but he made this very embarrassing faux pas to our former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and his wife, because he translated something, I think, from French, délicieux, which can mean delectable as well as lovely. So these things happen, right? Even with the most fluent, and it could happen even with someone you might think of as a native speaker, quote, of a language who has spent too much time hanging out in a source language culture and, you know, mixing up these meanings. So words can be very tricky, especially these false friends. Oh, I forgot to mention that my picture here, oops. These are puffins, not penguins, that I saw in Iceland. I thought they were very cute. They're like penguins, but they fly and they're a bit fatter. Anyway, that's false friends. Names and transliteration. I'm not going to go into this too much, but as I said, you know, there are different kinds of transliteration systems often in the one language. These are the two main ones in Mandarin in mainland China. These are the two main ones in Japanese. This kunreishiki system is still favored by the Japanese government in some areas. The Hepburn system of transliteration in Japanese is the one that most people know. So you've probably all seen matcha and futon, not matcha and futon. And the other thing with names is the problem of word order, name order. Do you present the name with the family name first or the first name first? You can choose either way in some languages, but you need to be consistent. The difficulty in Chinese, in Chinese or in Mandarin, is that Xi Jinping, for example, the president, is his family name is Xi and his given name is Jinping. The famous pianist, concert pianist, Yu Jia Wang, however, her family name is Wang and her given name is Yu Jia. And the reason why is that she is very active on the international stage in Western countries. So she, prefers to present her name in Western order. And this was very confusing. When I was living in Hong Kong, I used to go regularly to see the Hong Kong Philharmonic play. And their program is fascinating because they'll have all the Chinese names in Chinese characters, and they'll also have the transliteration. And depending on whether the musician was active in Asia or China or in the West, they would present their English names differently. And I think for someone who does not know much Chinese, it's very difficult for them to figure out which one is the family name and which one is the first name. And this, I often found, is a problem in reference lists, for example, in academic editing, when you've got names from different languages. And Japanese names are even more complicated. I'm not going to go into it here because we are totally running out of time. Now, syntactic distractions. So structural distractions at the level of the sentence or other larger structures. G. Okay. So we talked about the passive voice a bit. Negative questions are often a thing in Japanese and as well as in Chinese. If I ask you, for example, don't you like apples, Pamela? Then you can say, in English, you'd say, yeah, I like apples. Or nah, yeah, I don't like apples, no. But in Japanese and Chinese, you have to answer yes or no to the entire proposition, the statement. So do you not like apples? Yes, I do not like apples. Or no, I do like apples. It's often a problem in dialogue, and also in movies. There was an interesting presentation at one of the Japan Association Translator conferences where a subtitler commented on the problems in subtitling a Japanese film in English because there was a negative question asked and the actress had nodded, and in English the answer was no. So I think that the translator had to come up with, to recast the entire question to match the actual visual cues in the film because she couldn't change what the actor was doing.
Yeah. We have that in Indian languages also. Also say the negative question like, you're not going home now, are you? You're not going home. Yes, I am going home.
Right.
No, I'm not going home.
Yeah.
It will come. Yeah, and this is very common, and we have to tell people who are learning English that you have to reverse the verb and the subject. That are you going home now? You are not going home now. So this is a very typical thing because we translate our own language. It's a mother tongue influence that happens, and I think it happens in more than one of our languages.
Yeah. So it's kind of like an extension of the false friend issue where you're used to a particular structure in a language that you're stronger in, and then that sort of bleeds into everything else. The length of sentences, I mean, German sentences can be super, super long. So English language sentences written by German academics can be very, very long, and they know it, and they let me edit it. The order of elements in dates, for example, and addresses, as I pointed out, in dates as well, in Japanese and Chinese, we start with the year, the month, and then the day. And back translations is one issue that I think is quite fun to look into. Do you recognize this? Does anyone recognize this quotation? It's not accurate, It's a kind of a garbled quotation from English. Does it seem familiar to anyone? So it comes from, you've often heard me say, perhaps too often, the poetry is what is lost in translation. So poetry is what is lost in translation. See it in memes everywhere on the internet. So Robert Frost, famous poet. So the problem is that, often when you're translating a source text, the source text might mention a quotation that's taken from a translation from English into Japanese. And then the translator, not having realized that, will retranslate it or back translate it and garble the message even further. And of course, so there has to be some awareness that when you see a quotation, if you don't know, if it's academic, there'll probably be a reference, so it's easier to follow up. But in more general writing, sometimes these famous quotes just get quoted, and you need to know that and be aware of it and try and figure out where on earth this quotation came from if it was not from Japanese. Here's another one. I made this up from Google Translate. Does this seem familiar to anyone? If you exclude all the impossible things from an event, you will naturally see the truth, no matter how outlandish it is. Ah, very good! Sherlock Holmes. Thank you, a fellow Conan Doyle fan. Yep. So how often have I said to you that when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth? So this was a problem when I was on a plane once, I think it was 2 years ago, before the pandemic, watching a new Japanese series called Miss Sherlock, which I really liked. It's kind of like, the Sherlock series in England, except it's a Japanese female actor who is playing this Miss Sherlock role. And she says some of these, key quotes from Sherlock Holmes. And I was just, listening to it. But sometimes I would sort of jerk awake thinking, wait a minute, no, that sounds really familiar, but it's not, there's something wrong with it. So this wasn't the exact quote. There are a number of different subtitles and I think dubbings of that series. This is one I just made up from Google Translate. But it's something like this where it's just not quite the right quote. And obviously the translator has either had not enough time to figure out where the quote was from, does not know Conan Doyle very well, or had to, make some changes to fit the subtitles onto the screen. Who knows? But these back translations are something to be aware of when you're editing a translation. Here's an example of when to leave things well alone. So I don't know if you recognize this quotation from a famous novel from Russian, if you can guess from the translator's name. In the presence of Tikhon and the doctor, the women washed what had been he, as opposed to the women washed what was left of him. So this is actually from the death of old Prince Bolkonsky in Tolstoy's War and Peace. These are two very famous translators, especially Richard Cuvier and Larissa Vol. Oh, no, it's Volkonsky. Sorry, it's a typo there. Very bad typo. Sorry about that. So Richard Cuvier likes to respond to reviews. He's very active. So in London Review of Books, there was a review of his translation with Larissa of War and Peace. And Michael Woods had criticised his translation for using this unnatural term, what had been he, unnatural turn of phrase. And so Richard Cuvier wrote a letter to the London Review of Books in reply to this review, of course, to say, no doubt many readers will say they prefer the more idiomatic phrase anyway because it reads better in English, so what was left of him. That is the dilemma every translator faces. We chose to keep the strangeness where the original is strange. So this is just one interesting example of where maybe even if it doesn't read, you think it doesn't read very well in English, there is a reason for it. Usually it's in literature. Yes, the meaning has changed. I mean, in literature, of course, any change changes the meaning of the translations, you're right. So the focus of Tolstoy had deliberately used a rather strange phrase in Russian. I think so torch to bulo on, sorry for my horrible pronunciation, to focus on the death of the prince. And it wasn't so much to do with what was left of the body. It was to do with the fact that he was no longer who he was anymore. And that's what Richard Pevere argued is the reason why he and Larissa had translated it the way he did. Finally, looking at other issues beyond the text, so beyond the word and the sentence and the paragraph. One of my favorite translation theorists, Lawrence Venuti in the US, wrote a seminal book called The Translators Invisibility, A History of Translation, which I really recommend everyone to read. He talks about two different kinds of translation studies, translation strategies. One is foreignization, which is basically sending the reader abroad. And the other is domestication, which is bringing the author back home. And he basically argued, or he was very critical of the trend in the English publishing world about basically the domesticating practices in publishing, which have contributed to the suppression of difference in source text, as English readers expect to read translations that are immediately intelligible. And so he is talking about challenging the dominant values in the target language culture through foreignizing strategies of translation, rather than assimilating the source text to the target language culture and values. Other issues I don't really have time to go into, but think about different norms and values across cultures, societies, and religions. And what sells in each country, what is persuasive, what is considered a logical order, an argument in an academic text. All these things differ across cultures, across languages. What's funny as well, the difficulty of translating humor and puns and cultural allusions. There's one, I don't know if any of you have ever watched the animation or anime Dragon Ball Z. It's a very popular Japanese anime. Anyway, in Dragon Ball Z, there are these two monsters that live in hell. They're monsters in hell. And, Japan is very syncretic in their religion, so they're not very fussed about heaven and hell. They use the terms quite indiscriminately and, creatively. But when this anime was translated into English, I watched the dubbed version in US English and I watched the subtitles, and I was really confused because these two monsters in hell, they were wearing T-shirts that didn't make any sense. It said something like HILI or something like that. And I thought, that doesn't look right somehow. And I couldn't remember because I'd read this manga a long time ago, looked it up and realized, oh no, both the monsters were wearing T-shirts that said hell on it. But for the purposes of the US audience, or for the sensibilities of the English audience, English-speaking audience, they had deliberately fuzzed some of the writing on the T-shirts, so it didn't read hell anymore. And then the whole storyline changed. So it wasn't about heaven and hell and, the characters going between heaven and hell. It's just all action as well. It's nothing really religious or anything. But they took out all the references to religion in it, which I thought was very weird, but also quite amusing. Vivek, are we okay for time, or have I gone completely over time?
Yeah, you can go on, Sara. We do have some time.
Okay. So one last thing I wanted to talk about was dialects and varieties. I prefer to use the word varieties, which is a neutral linguistic term, instead of dialect. So here is a quote from J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. It's do you know which character says this? Which character talks like this? Does anybody know Harry Potter well? And keep to the path. Right now, we're going to split into two parties. Hagrid, yes, very good. I think J.K. Rowling overdoes it a little bit. She sort of takes off every G, and everything is t and th and y, which is actually not something that's recommended in contemporary fiction writing. Many of the fiction editors I talked to said that they don't like to, that they like to edit out a lot of this stuff. Here's an opposite example of a very difficult to read. Can anybody figure out what this says? You don't have to write it. If anyone wants to unmute themselves, they can say it. It's from Mancunian. Actually, Paul is here from New South Wales, but he's originally from Scotland, so he might be able to read this.
No pressure. I might pass. It's
Oh, really?
it's been over 20 years, Sarah.
So this Oliver Ormerod is a famous dialect writer. So there's a difference between what we call eye dialect and literary dialect. Eye dialect is what you see in J.K. Rowling's work. So stuff like, and keep to the path. I mean, to the path is how all of us usually speak. There's not much difference between T-E-R and to, actually, in pronunciation. The difference is only in the I. And it must have been, she says, you know, he says, or Hagrid says. I mean, B-E-E-N and B-I-N, usually, you know, if we're unstressing our vowels, then we say we must have been doing this. So there's no real difference in pronunciation. What the effect of this I dialect, as it's been called by George Krapp back in 1926, this I dialect is that it basically draws or depicts characters who are, you know, uneducated because it looks like they can't spell. Because there's actually no real difference in the way they are pronouncing things. And of course, in the film versions of Harry Potter, Hagrid has, I think, a West Country dialect or accent, so it's a lot more natural, and he can, you can tell from his actions and his body language what his social class is and things like that. But the way J.K. Rowling does it in print is actually quite simplistic with this use of I dialect. But it doesn't mean to say that it's completely wrong to try to represent dialect, because why should everything be written in standard English or standard Japanese? It's quite boring, actually. You know, different varieties of English, different varieties of any language are very rich in humour and in emotion. So there is a huge movement. There has always been a huge movement, you know, with Robbie Burns and Oliver Ormerod and other writers in Japan like Kenji Miyazawa, writers who try to actually write down or transcribe the pronunciation. So this is, I can see Paul concentrating very hard here. Let me see if I can find it too. I think, oh no, did I not write it down? This is something like, oh, full, true, a particular account of both what I see, so what I saw and what I heard. We're going to the great exhibition in London and a great deal of information beside. So this was actually the title of his book. Here's another example. I think you'll recognize this if you know your classics. Pamela. I know you know this. I'm not going to try to pronounce this, by the way. What text is this from? Oh, I'm missing a square bracket here. Yes, so Pamela's mentioned Zadie Smith, who writes dialogue very well. This is someone a bit older. This is George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion. Oh. So this is Eliza when she first appears as the flower girl and she's yelling about, oh, you know, why are you taking away my flowers without paying? Whether you pay me for them. And George Bernard Shaw has a, you know, quite, he was very interested in phonetics and in transcribing regional and social varieties. And here, Pygmalion is all about that. But here he gets away with just using this transcription here. And for the rest of it, he says, here, with apologies, this desperate attempt to represent her dialect without a phonetic alphabet must be abandoned as unintelligible outside London. So that's one way a writer can get around it. Okay, so some examples of I dialect. So basically there's not any difference in the way it's pronounced. It's really a difference in the way it's presented, which makes the speaker or the character look uneducated, which is something that we really try to avoid in our progressive times now. However, some kinds of I dialect, like Hellebuck and whodunit, have become so standardized in our vocabulary or lexicon that they're in the dictionary now. So some advice from some advice from a writer, a guide to writing fiction. Dialect should be achieved by the rhythm of the prose, by the syntax, the dictions, idioms and figures of speech, by the vocabulary indigenous to the locale. Eye dialect is almost always pejorative and it's patronizing, which is true. I agree. But if we go back to translated texts and translations, the problem is that with translations, how does an English reader know anything about the rhythms and sounds of Northern Japanese varieties of a country farmer in Tohoku, for example? So what often happens with, for example, Kenji Miyazawa's literature, he uses bits of dialect or the Tohoku variety in his literature. It often gets translated into Eye dialect because that's the default generic, uneducated kind of, no region kind of non-standard variety that's presented in literature. So we want to try and avoid that. And so there are other ways in which we can get around it. So, for example, rhythm, as we say, word choice, some well-chosen regionalisms, avoiding cliches like the Aussie crikey, blimey, skirts, and g'day. But some well-chosen regionalisms, some footnotes if it's a academic translation of literature, and also using something like non-standard grammar and word order, like he done gone and she be waiting for you every day, I don't get no satisfaction. To give a sense of someone's background without being derogatory. Anne Banfield in Unspeakable Sentences, Narration and Representation in the Language of Fiction said that we read novels to ourselves in voices that we supply. We supply our own accents or even foreign language based on skillful hints from the author or the translator. So we don't need to have something quite as extreme as Bernard Shaw's transcription or Oliver Ormerod's, but to give some kind of sense of this regional variety or social variety without resorting to just deliberate misspellings. That's Eye dialect. Okay. Finally, if you're interested in continuing working on editing translations or as a translator, I recommend that you find your niche, find a source language that you can work with culture that you have some awareness of, but never stop learning. This is my cat who died, but he was a stray cat for over 10 years and he came to live with us and he never stopped learning. So one day he discovered this heater and we couldn't get him away from it. I was very impressed. He was a very flexible old cat. And so that's why I always think of him when I think about continuing professional development. He continued until the day he died. The end. So there's my contact details there. Love to hear your questions if we have any time.
Every slide has been very, very delightful. Every slide.
Oh, thank
really,
you.
I enjoyed it completely. Every bit of it.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, for 25 years, I've been struggling with one language. You're trying to look at different languages and see, move from one side to the other side and come back from there to this side. Really very good. Enjoyed every bit of it.
Sharing now so I can see you all. That work?
I'll say, 素敵ですね.
ありがとうございます。嬉しいです。Well, I mean, I'd love to hear from anyone who's worked with translations or has translated before. I mean, it doesn't have to be anything, major that you've translated.
I had a lot of fun because I had to edit a book that was translated, and the translations were sometimes so crazy. I've mentioned it in this forum before, that it was a translation from a very highly awarded author from the Tamil Nadu. And the translator insisted on saying innocent mother's virgin boy. And I kept telling her that you didn't have to say so many words. You could have just said innocent boy or mama's boy. And that would indicate that he was a very innocent and inexperienced sexually young man. But she insisted, no, we have to say that. And I thought it was going to make every reader sort of stop and chew on it for a while, because it didn't sound like a translation. But I've had a lot of fun with Swedish, because of course I don't speak Swedish, but Svenska has some very interesting habits. And there was a time when they had something called Janta law, and that was to always put yourself down. Like today we want to say everybody is great, you're beautiful the way you are. But the Janta law was saying that there's nothing special about you. And there were 8 different points that Svenska was telling everyone that.
Am I frozen, or is it?
I think we have lost her voice. Yeah, I think.
Oh no.
Audio.
We have something to say.
Yeah, Sara, there is a question by Pamela. She's asking, how do you handle transliterated English words in translations?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, so that's another problem, especially when transliterated English words are not so much of a problem, because usually the translator will recognize those English words. So, for example, if it's an English name, for example, like Donald Trump or whatever, they'll recognize that. The problem occurs more when it's say, for example, a German word or Italian word or something that's been transliterated into Japanese. And then the English translator often can't figure out where on earth that's from. So this is why it's very important to have a style sheet. And, most translators do use a style sheet, but their style sheet is often not really suitable for editors. So there needs to be a bit more coordination in that regard.
I was thinking really more about when a character in a novel, for example, in dialogue, might use an English word, and it's showing that they're a little bit pretentious.
Right.
So how do you get across in translation that they're using a word that's a little bit an academic term or an IT?
It's very, it really depends on the context. So the author that I studied for my PhD, Kenji Miyazawa, created a lot of fantasy worlds, a bit like, Hayao Miyazaki's sort of European style worlds, right? Where in Japan, these are considered, in quotes, exotic. But for example, Kenji Miyazawa wrote about 2 characters called Giovanni and Campanella. And it just, seemed wrong to just translate that into Giovanni and Campanella, because it wasn't, and Giovanni and Campanella were in the 1920s eating, tomatoes, which was exotic for 1920s Japanese readers, but it was just so normal. And they're eating bread and drinking milk and, all very exotic, in quotes, for Japanese readers of the time, and even maybe today. Not your average Japanese food, but it just seems so bland and normal in English. And, admittedly, this novel is not very popular in translation in English. And the funny thing is that, a lot of modern Japanese authors, especially the ones who've been awarded Nobel Prizes, have a Western audience in mind. They have a translator in mind. So one of my favorite authors, Yasunari Kawabata, wrote Snow Country. He was the first Japanese Nobel Prize winner. It's about a geisha in an hot spring onsen town. And it obviously very much appeals to that whole Madame Butterfly, mentality of the West. And the translator, who is a great translator, Seidensticker, even admitted that he would have tried harder with the translation, because there are quite a few problems with it, if he'd known that he was going to win the Nobel Prize. So, and no, I don't think anyone's ever tried to translate it ever since, because it's a very difficult novel to translate. Kawabata is someone who, flashes pictures at you. It's almost like having all these impressionist paintings flashed at you. There's no plot. And generally, stories with plot-based stories, are very Western-style plot-based stories, translate very well. So Haruki Murakami, all these contemporary Japanese authors tend to translate much better than more traditional style. But the reason why I think Kawabata is still quite popular is that there's so many, exotic features for Western readers, like the geishas and the onsens and this sort of snow country. And yeah, I still love his work, but I do prefer the author that I researched, Kenji Miyazawa, because he had a more cosmopolitan outlook, and he never really looked at, Japan as a nation. He was, quite religious and Buddhist, so he saw all humans beings and non-human animals as well as being sentient beings, which was very unusual in the 1920s, because most of the Japanese authors in the 1920s were so much focused on, thinking about what does it mean to be Japanese? How do we compare to the Chinese? How do we compare to the West? And for me, reading that, given my background, it's actually very boring. Like, I don't care. Like, it's just, get over it. Let's look at the world. Let's stop thinking about, Japan and the West or Japan and Asia. But it's fascinating for a lot of Western readers. And so a lot of the popular modern Japanese novels from the 1920s and 30s tend to be focused on those themes. Sorry, I get a bit carried away when I get into literature.
Yes, Sara. Next question is from Madhwan. He wants to know what's your take on computer-based translations or technology-based translations, like.
Right. Yeah. So that's been like a huge point of discussion among a lot of like in translation forums. There are some, especially I think older translators, who are worried about that. I think that, machine translation has its place. It's quite amazing. Probably about 10 years ago, Google Translate was not as good as it used to be. Recently, I find myself getting tricked by Google Translate or other, AI. So I've received some, because I charge more for translation than editing. But sometimes my clients will say, oh, look, I've translated this myself. Can you just edit it? And I look at it quickly and I say, oh, yeah, it looks editable, right? And then I look at it carefully and I realize, okay, it's like that text I just showed you, the sample text, where the sentences are grammatically correct. Everything is there, but there is something really off about it. And then I put a few sentences through Google Translate and realize, oh, okay, that's where it came from. And of course, depending on the nature of the text, like, for example, if it's a scientific text that is very much content-based and, it's very specific terminology, but as long as you get the terminology right, it's very difficult. But, as long as you know all that scientific terminology, the actual purpose of the text is quite basic. It's to convey this basic content about scientific research results on COVID-19 vaccines or whatever. But like the text I showed you today, where the objective is a lot more, nuanced, and you want to try and come across as being friendly but competent, you're a new colleague, you want to show off some of your previous stuff, and it just wasn't being achieved. That's the kind of thing that I think computers still, maybe one day they can, but they can't achieve right now. So for literature and all these other things, I think the other way technology is helping is to help by creating databases and also research, word banks and things like that. But yeah, it's the same thing with editing, right? Grammarly is never going to be able to replace a good structural editor, for example. But Perfected helps in many ways. Does that answer your question? And I think another thing I forgot to mention is, I used to supervise or train a few student translators. And I find that when you first start translating, if you're thinking of starting to translate, one of the challenges is to get over your foreign language class mode. So many of the student translators I had were, so-called native speakers of English. They were from the US or Australia or the UK. And they were probably pretty good writers if they were only thinking in English. But because they'd spent many years studying Japanese, and they were very proud that they had studied Japanese and they were so good at Japanese, and they really were. But in Japanese language classes, like in other language classes, you're given these sentences that are very artificial to translate, right? Like Google Translate. And your task is to complete the grammatical exercise or vocabulary exercise and translate the sentence in a particular way for the teacher to give you a tick. And obviously in the professional context, that is not what's needed. But I felt like a lot of these student translators were giving me these texts, kind of like that sample text I gave you, where they were showing me that they understood the structure of the Japanese, but it was such an unnatural English sentence. It was completely unusable. And so I was like, well, look, I'm very impressed that you understand that this is a passive sentence with a subordinate clause, wonderful. But you've got to move on from that. In the professional arena, you've got to think in terms of, okay, you've spent that time translating, getting that content and the structure across, and then you've got to get into your English language mode. Forget about the Japanese. Try to remember what that Japanese was trying to convey. If it's a letter, if it's an advertisement, if it's a, newsletter article, even an academic text, and just try to convey that as though the author was writing in English, we're writing in English. And that's something that's often very difficult to do when you first start translating. And I mean, I'm sure I made the same mistakes when I first started too. And it's quite disheartening for these student translators because, they're usually the A+ students in their language classes. So yeah, that's just something to watch out for. And I think everyone goes through it. But at some stage, you've got to get into professional mode. And I think that's why also I encourage all translators to take editing classes, because that refocuses you on English. If you've spent years and years studying Japanese as an American or an Australian in Australia or the US, then you've probably focused more on Japanese than you have on your English language classes. Even if you're, and you think, oh, it's okay, I can do the English bit because I'm a native speaker of English, but you can't, because you haven't been trained as an English language editor or writer. And that's something that I think a lot of people forget.
Thank you so much for this, Sara.
You're welcome.
And I've been, translating a little bit of Hindi work into English, and I totally get the part where Google Translate is not accurate, and we have to see the emotion or the subtext of the original text when we're translating. So this has been really interesting and helpful for me. Thank you so much.
Do you find yourself, do you get a lot of bilingual publications between Hindi and English, for example? Do you find yourself comparing the translations sometimes?
Sometimes I do, but generally it's just English that I see. This is the first time I'm working with something on Hindi. So It's been difficult because I try to get it to the level of English that I'm used to. So it gets difficult, but it's worth it. Learning all the way.
When you say comparing translations, there's a question by DK.
Yeah.
Murakami's books are translated by a variety of translators. Does that affect the way the source language gets communicated to the reader?
Definitely. I mean, I believe that every translation is an interpretation. So there is no deeper reading or closer reading of a literary text than a translation, I think. Because in order to translate a literary text, you need to really get into the guts of things. And there's so many things I didn't notice about the Japanese novels I read until I started to try to translate them. And you keep noticing little bits and pieces, and then you keep getting impressed by the author and thinking, oh, wow, the author's done this. The only other time I've been super impressed by authors is when I was working at this educational publisher editing English language books. And I had to abridge English language classics. And Frankfurt was not English, but anyway, I did Jane Eyre, I did Dickens, Great Expectations, I did Wuthering Heights, I think, and, all kinds of Watership Down. And I must say that the author who impressed me most was Dickens. It was very difficult to abridge Dickens. Every time I tried to delete something from his, Dickens has many problems. I have many post-colonial issues with him. Don't want to meet him in the afterlife. I'd rather meet Wilkie Collins, but still, as an author, I was just so impressed that it was very difficult to take anything, remove anything, because everything had a purpose. And then, my team would be writing Q&A, and the Q&A wouldn't work because they deleted something. So out of all the authors I've ever had, English language authors I've ever had to work with, abridging, Charles Dickens was definitely the biggest challenge. And every time I deleted one of his sentences, I sort of said, "I'm so sorry, Mr. Dickens." But yeah, it was a great exercise. And again, that was because we were thinking about English language teaching and abridging, and that was just an incredible way to really get into the structure and meanings of words and sentences and paragraphs in the text. Kind of like, I guess, what a structural fiction editor does, which I don't do. But yeah, that's my answer to your question, that I love all translations of any novel, even if they're bad, because there's always something to be learned about it. And again, I shouldn't have used the word bad, even if there are problems with, there's problems with any translation, but just like with the example I gave of War and Peace, whether you like what Richard Pevere and Larissa Volkonsky did or not, it certainly makes you think about the meaning of that particular phrase, and then it adds to your interpretation of the story, and also your appreciation of Tolstoy. And if you don't speak the source language, especially, it's fascinating to compare different translations. One of my favorite Russian authors is Mikhail Bulgakov. Again, Pevere and Volkonsky translated it. I find their translation very academic and boring. Hope he's not watching, so he doesn't send me a letter. But I am impressed by how academic they are. But there are more accessible translations, and I think that I'm studying Russian now, but nowhere near the level where I could read Bulgakov in Russian. But I think one day, if I could read Bulgakov in Russian, I might appreciate Pevere's translation more. So I think that our appreciation of a translation differs based on how much we know and understand of the source language and the source language culture.
See, I assume
Hi, Sara, fellow Russian learner. Hey, Venkat, please go ahead.
Здравствуйте. Меня зовут Sara.
Здравствуйте. Здравствуйте. If Venkat wants to go ahead, I'll just follow him.
You go ahead. Moshmi, go ahead.
Okay, I'm glad you brought up Pevere and Boronowski's translations, because they're kind of seen as very stilted now, and there are far more accessible ones in Russian literature. Then also there's Constance Garnett, who has her own kind of issues that she brings to the translations of Russian books. So, it kind of comes back to this point. I was reading this author, Viv Groskop. She has written this book called Life Lessons from Russian Literature, where she says that, she echoes your thoughts. She says that, I will read any translation of a book, however, whatever the quality, because the translator has spent 5 years translating it. It can't be that bad. They have given so much to the book, to the work. So it is worth it. It is worth just reading it. Just adding that in. Yeah, thank you. All yours.
Definitely.
And thanks, Sara. I really enjoyed the session. All the multi-dimensional look at translation. That was just great.
Oh, good. Thank you. Well, please feel free to, send me an email or, connect with me on Instagram or LinkedIn, whatever you're comfortable with. I really am grateful to Vivek and Venkat and all the other ICF team for welcoming me here today and, just giving me the opportunity to contribute to this amazing wealth of resources that you have in your YouTube archive. And I think it's just a great contribution to the wider editing community, English language editing community. So thank you so much.
Arigatou gozaimashita.
Arigato. And thank you to you all, because you're always so welcoming. Every session I've ever attended, as a participant or a presenter, you've always been so very welcoming.
Yeah, I am the resident auntie of ICF. and if there was time, I would sing from My Fair Lady also. But I don't think anyone to run away. And everybody's there is a saying in our country that when somebody sings badly, all the donkeys come. So since nobody wants any donkeys, I'm not going to sing.
I like donkey too, so I can sing badly. I'm a very bad.
I sing badly, but I don't care. Anyway.
And Sara, two questions. When you edit, when you're editing a translation, And suppose you sense problems. Okay, do you keep the original with you? Suppose you know the language. Number one, you keep looking at it. Okay, and when you do that, by to what extent does it slow down your editing, or do you ever do that?
When I'm editing a translation and I see a problem.
Yeah.
when do I not see a problem? Look, it's difficult. I mean, sometimes I'm given translations. I'm just given the TT, right? The target text, the translated text. I don't have the source text. I can't access the source text for whatever reason. So I have to work with it. And that's similar maybe, to working with an author whose primary language might not be English, for example. But the translation could have been done by someone whose primary language is English, but they might have had a not very good understanding of the source. And I can suspect, like I did with the text that I created for you, and I can query, but I'm a bit limited in what I can do. Luckily, though, I have a lot of very regular clients who trust me. And sometimes they'll send me a text and I'll look at it and I'll say, look, I think it would be easier if I just retranslate this. I can charge you for editing it, but for me to fix up, if they send me the source text, I can compare and, fix up the anomalies and problems. But for me to do that, it would take longer than for me to actually translate it from scratch, because you're fixing someone else's work, and no matter what, I'll still be distracted by that person, by the translator's voice as well. And if the translator's voice is not very accurate, then it's just easier if I just make it into, my version of the author's voice rather than that translator's version of the author's voice. And often that's, the Google Translator's voice or something, is less experienced maybe. And also, there in some projects, people are very much pressed for time. Subtitling is like that as well. People, working with low rates and very tight deadlines, so they don't have the time to do all the research as well. So that's what translation checkers are often for in translation agencies. They're hired to check the accuracy of the translation, not just editors. So I have done that sort of translation checking role as well. But I always find it easier to do the translation myself.
Hi, Sara. Bernali here. Hi. It was a lovely session and
Thank you.
Very entertaining. Very, very entertaining. And and I love the picture of your cat.
Oh, thank you.
I had a similar black cat, and I was like, okay, I could connect with what you were saying at so many levels, because especially the one with the Japanese text, the way the person was introducing. So I've worked with a couple of academic texts which came from non-native speakers, especially from Japan and China. So I faced that problem firsthand because it was not actually a translated text, like how you mentioned.
Yes.
It was basically a non-native English speaker writing academics in English. So I faced the same language problem.
Yeah.
Excessive politeness, excessive self-humility, which I think comes from Japanese culture, as in like self-denigration. I've written a thesis about politeness strategies, so I was familiar with how Japanese culture imbibes politeness in everything they speak, the way they any kind of communication. So that was coming excessively, especially in business communication writing or scientific writing. It was really challenging how to segregate the cultural expressions and the stuff of the matter, the real stuff which needs to be conveyed.
Yeah.
So what's your take on this?
Oh, wow. Well, so the reason why I didn't talk about, so I talk about working with authors from diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds. So I try to avoid the words, as I said before, native speaker, non-native speaker, because I find that academia really discriminates against people they think are non-native speakers. And there's a whole range of non-native speakers out there, you know, or people who are classed as non-native speakers.
I am a non-native speaker.
Exactly.
I am a non-native writer.
And I mean, as I explained, maybe I'm a non-native speaker as well, right? Because, you know, my first language was French, and then it was Japanese, and then it was English. So technically English was the third language that I encountered in my life. Yeah, so I think that authors in general are very diverse. So with I work mainly as an academic editor in the editing realm. And so, you know, I get authors who have been working in IT or management for 20, 30 years and have decided to come back and do a PhD. Their writing is very, you know, businessese, and they have no idea how to structure a thesis, how to use references. You know, they have to learn all that from scratch again because it's been 20, 30 years since they were at university. On the other hand, I'll have, like, you know, other authors, academics who might not have come from an English dominant country, but they've been, you know, reading and writing in English in their field, in architecture or in, you know, whatever scientific field or linguistics or whatever, for decades. And so they understand the basic principles of academic writing. Some of their phrasing might be a little bit unnatural. Sometimes their grammar might be, you know, the German speakers tend to say, since I did this as a child, I am learning English or something because of the way German grammar is structured as als ich ein Kind war. But I mean, those kinds of things are, for me, a lot easier to fix up than trying to teach someone who has spent 30 years outside of academia and is now trying to write a PhD thesis. So I think it's very unfair of academia to just make this, you know, broad distinction between native and non-native, because authors are so much more diverse.
Whole culture, it's a whole writing culture in there that you have to learn, and it's like many years of knowledge accumulated, and it's difficult for somebody to just suddenly know all of that. Something that we have worked years developing.
But again, you know, there's also the issue of writers who are writing in English and they actually need English language lessons, which, you know, with some of my clients, I do tutor them as well. So we have, you know, Zoom sessions, and I am more of a writing coach rather than just an editor, because I don't like, when I used to work for academic editing agencies where, you know, you get these anonymous sort of theses and essays and you just fix it up and send it back and you never hear from, you don't know who that person is. And I found that quite, I mean, it was, you know, regular work, but after a while I found it kind of a bit soul destroying. So I like that personal connection, being able to get to know each client and help them, you know, improve as writers and develop their own sort of authentic voice. And so I have, you know, certain clients I've been working with for years, and each time it's not like just because they get better at English that, you know, they need less editing. Obviously there's always more that I can edit. The better their English becomes, and, you know, the more authentic their own voice is. So I think that my advice, if it's possible, when you have authors like that, is to just try to continue working with them one-on-one, and, you know, develop a working relationship with them. Because someone who's done a PhD, you know, is likely to go on to academia and they'll have a career. They'll need to continue publishing, you know, and if they trust you to be someone who can not only just fix up their essay or, you know, their journal article at last minute and make it conform to a style guide, will actually teach you and coach you and make you a better writer and make it easier for you to write, you know, and help you express and articulate your ideas more deeply, then they're going to be with you forever, you know, and you'll have this amazing relationship, and it will be more satisfying for you as an editor and more satisfying for them as a writer. So, I mean, it's not always possible, right? It depends on the client, but I think
it's not always.
It also relates to how you present yourself as an editor. You know, do you market yourself to just accept everyone possible, or do you say, you know, try and, I mean, I have, you know, I've only recently started doing this, but, you know, with my LinkedIn profile, I'm trying to develop this website that's always in development, but, you know, try to actually, you know, tell people who I am and what I do. And people who want to work with me, people who want to work with this weirdo with this, background balcony with birds and who's vegan and, likes animals so much, they come and work with me, and that works out fine because I can't edit for the whole world. And if I can just edit with people who want to continue working with me for years, it's amazing. So, it's
That's
hard.
a great plan.
It's not something that I could do.
And I do love animals as well.
It's not something I could do when I first started. It was I did
Basically
cats on all kinds of jobs. It's just. But I always think of my cat Samson, who as I said, was always learning and was always focused on his goal, which was either food or sleep or going to the bathroom. And he wasn't distracted. He didn't care about what other people thought of him. He didn't care if other people thought he was a dirty street cat. And so he taught me a lot. And I think ever since I met Samson,
cats teach us a lot of things.
They do, right? Yeah. Birds
need to focus on what's important and ignore everything that's irrelevant, and develop develop meaningful relationships with only who or what matters. I think I'll take that as an advice to declutter. Declutter and develop better clients relationships.
And
thank you, Sara. It was amazing.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah.
I have to admit that I found it.
Yeah.
Sorry? Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, please go ahead.
For your comments. I'm glad it resonated. I have to admit that for a long time I was. Sorry?
I'm like, absolutely, we have to find our niche and stick with it. We can't work with everybody. Like you said, we can't edit for the world.
Yeah, totally. And it's something I've only realized, in the last year or two, really. So I sound like I know what I'm talking about, but it's taken me this long. And I remember when I first started out and I was working with academic agencies, I was worried because, my name doesn't sound very English. The Sara does, but Kitaoji doesn't. I wondered whether I would have to create a website with a generic editing name and hide my real name, or hide behind my PhD. I see what other English language editors are doing in the US and Canada and the marketing and all those things that I'm not really very good at doing. And I kept comparing myself, and then I realized, Samson doesn't do this, my cat, and he's very happy and satisfied. So then I decided, eventually, you just have to be yourself and find out what works best for you and what's going to make you happy, rather than looking at other people, whether they're fellow editors or clients or translators. So,
see, among all the languages you listed out, I'm just curious, in what are the languages in which you think?
It really depends. I think definitely for academic things, it would be English. Although if it's Japanese literature, I do tend to think in Japanese. And, I have a very interesting anecdote about that. So for my master's, I also wrote about Kenji Miyazawa. And my professor was a Bulgarian professor who had a PhD from Moscow University, a PhD from Tokyo University. I hope she's not watching this. She's quite scary, intimidating. But, I love her very much, Professor Tsvetana Kristeva. Anyway, so she was very fluent in Japanese, better than me even, and, also in classical Japanese, because she was a classical Japanese scholar of Tale of Genji. And so I used to discuss with her about my thesis in Japanese. And, the novel was in Japanese, but I was talking about translation issues into English. So I was intending to write my thesis in English. And then, after all, and, I had all these ideas, and I was always discussing with her and my Japanese colleagues and my other international, classmates as well in Japanese about it, because, they all liked Kenji Miyazawa. And then, in the last few months, I sat down to write my master's thesis. And, I did all my education in Australia, 1 year in Kyoto as an undergraduate, as an exchange student, but up to honours at Melbourne Uni, I was in Australia, in English. And so I didn't even doubt that I wouldn't be able to write this master's thesis in English, but I couldn't. I had this absolute writer's block where I could not transfer all the discussion in Japanese into English on the page. into my thesis. It was the most painful experience I have ever had. I was so devastated because I've always been one of those people, even in primary school and high school, I could dash off an essay in the car at last minute and get an A+. You know, it was never a problem for me. And suddenly I couldn't write this thesis. And my professor was just, you know, furious. And I somehow managed to still, you know, please don't look up my master's thesis and read it because it's horrible. It's sort of this, it's maybe not as bad as a sample text I showed you, but it's this sort of convoluted, you know, Japanese thinking that I'm trying to get into English on paper, and it didn't work. So what my professor, who's a genius, said to me after that experience, Sara, we're never going to do this again. Never. You know, from now on, for your PhD, if you've decided you're going to write it in English, we're just going to discuss it in English. We can talk about all your fun stuff, your boyfriends, your cat, your whatever you like about in Japanese. But we're going to discuss your thesis in English. And I did, and my PhD was fine. So this is what I mean by, you know, there was, I think there was one editor who once commented, oh, you know, all these writers writing in, you know, English, and it's not their first language. Why don't they just write in their first language, Japanese or Chinese or whatever it is, and get it translated? And I thought about that, and I thought, no, that doesn't work, because a lot of these authors are reading and writing in English. Their field is in English. They're not reading and writing in Japanese and then translating it into English themselves either, you know. So my parents were the same. They did their masters and PhD, their masters in Texas, their PhD at ANU in Australia. And they wrote and read most of their resources were in English, because they weren't even studying Japanese cultures or anything. They were studying Mexican kinship systems in Texas and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in Australia. So there was nothing in Japanese for them to read. So to tell them then that they should have written their thesis in Japanese and then had it translated is absolutely ridiculous, and also, you know, not in anyone's budget usually, and no journal is ever going to publish a bilingual, you know, there are very few journals that publish bilingual articles with translations. So, you know, it's a matter of how we work with writers whose primary language is not English, and help them develop a unique and sort of authentic voice that doesn't necessarily have to be an American or Australian voice. It's some kind of, you know, international English. One of the examples I wanted to give you, which I didn't have time for, was my work with tourist signs in Japan, which Akiko, who's here from the US, has been working on as well. But, you know, when I was working on tourist signs in Japan, if you can imagine all the people who come to Japan to read tourist signs in English, and not necessarily native English speakers. They're all the people who can't read the Japanese signs. Sometimes there's a Mandarin sign, sometimes there's a Korean sign, but generally it's Japanese and English. So the English sign is really important, because all these so-called non-native speakers are going to be relying on the English sign. So the kind of English that we use for these signs needs to be not just plain language, you know, but really considering what kind of structures and vocabulary are more accessible for people whose primary language may not be English, and to not make it too American or too Australian or British, to make it some kind of like an international English. And of course, you know, having taught English as an additional language or a second language or foreign language to different students, I found that quite easy to do, because I know what kind of grammatical structures people learn when they're learning English, you know, and so-called native English speakers often don't know that. So what they think is easy is not necessarily easy for someone who's learning English as an adult. And that's also something that's very important to consider. How can we develop, you know, a more international, accessible, global kind of English? So, but that's a topic for another webinar, all three.
Thanks, Sara, for a very wonderful presentation. And I hope the weather gets better
Thank
at
you.
your place soon. And maybe next time we are able to see you on the balcony with the birds.
Yeah, I'm so sorry, the birds. I advertise it with the birds and there are no birds, but I put lots of birds in my presentation.
Yeah.
I tried my best to actually put in some birds in the registration form. For some reason, it simply did not work.
They didn't want to go in there. Okay, that's all right. They're fussy. You have to be nice with them. They warm up to you after all. Pamela knows, because Pamela's been visit my balcony many times, and the more she comes, the friendlier the birds have been. So actually, I think sometimes I like her better than they like me because, you know, she looked after them while I was away. Wearing colourful colours helps, Venkat. You have to wear, you know, lorikeet, like rainbow colours next time.
Yeah. Thanks, Sara, and thanks all the participants. Next Sunday, our session will be in the evening at 6 p.m. And the speaker is Indu Shanmugam Guzman, EFA Boston chapter coordinator, who will be like taking a session on differences between US and British English. So please do join us.
Awesome.
Yeah, do join us for that session. And on Saturdays, we have our travel series sessions at 4 p.m. So come for those also. And before we end, I want a closing comment from Pamela.
Pamela, you're unmuted.
Hello, I'm not sure what to say, except that this is the first time I've been present for one of these sessions and I love it. I'll be back again, and so interesting to hear. I mean, Sara and I see each other and talk a lot, but I learned an enormous amount from her presentation today. And we'll have lots of things to talk about next time we see each other or chat on the phone. And I think it's always like that, isn't it? You know, when you focus on a topic, all kinds of new ideas come out. So I've got notes of all kinds of things that I want to talk about later. And it's great to be here. Thank you very much for having me. And I look forward to meeting you all again.
Thank you. It's been an honor to have you here.
Yeah, thanks, Pamela.
We do too. We look forward to meeting you too.
Thank you, Auntie.
Thanks everyone. Have a nice day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
You brightened up our very grey, rainy Sydney